Hello, my name
Hi.
is Roger Casali from the Europeans, and I'm with Emeritus Professor Juliet Lodge. Juliet, hello, thank you for being with us.
Hi. Good to see you.
Juliet, you were European Women of the Year in 1992. I know this because I was doing my master's at the time in European Affairs, reading your book, and it said so on the back cover, and I thought, that's somebody I'd like to meet. That's a woman to look up to. How did it feel to win European Woman of the Year in 1992?
Well, the first thing was it was a massive shock because I had no idea there was any such thing, any such awards of any such nature. And I think the biggest thing that was very striking was that as a Brit at a time when the British government was vacillating about Europe and having some very difficult conversations, it was very odd to be a Brit who'd been given this award for what had turned out to be voluntary work I'd been doing in talking about things European and why the single market was going to be a very good idea to voluntary sectors, to everybody outside academia, and having very interesting conversations about what the opportunities were. And one could have exactly the same conversations now, which is what is really quite shocking, about what we're losing as a result of what's happened in Britain.
I don't know if you were still on the same platform as Margaret Thatcher in 1992, but in 1987 you must have been. She was a great advocate of the single market.
Yes, she was. And at that time, one of the things that the British were talking about all the time was one mustn't constrain sovereignty and sovereignty this and sovereignty that. And they refused to talk about things like legal convergence, getting lawyers together, getting judges together, getting the police together within some kind of treaty framework. And at the same time, they wanted to have European activity to combat terrorism. And so part of my research at that time was on security dimensions of what was going on in Europe. And we kept pressing this idea that in fact, if you're going to have freedom of movement, and just assuming it's a few tins and crates and trucks crossing the channel was absolutely ludicrous. It made no sense whatsoever because anything moves, and it transpired that in the end everything did move, body parts, corrupt practices, things you could see, things you couldn't see, bad people, good people, everything. And it took some time for that to sink into the minds of, shall we say, the political masters, compared to, say, the civil servants, the people on the ground who had to deal with the pragmatics of freedom of movement.
That was quite a challenge, and as you've described it, an unexpected challenge at the time. How did Europe rise to the challenge? What happened next?
Well, we have to go back and think that there was a group of MEPs who formed the Kangaroo Group, and a group within the Benelux countries and the original founders of the European Union, who were very open to the idea that if you're going to have a single market and you're going to abolish the internal geographical physical borders, that perhaps one needed to create a cluster of countries who were going to try this out. And that's in fact what happened. You had a cluster within what was then an EU of 9 states and 12 states and then 15 as we got the Scandinavian countries joining, and Austria as a neutral country, who said, well, let's dare think about what this could actually mean, and who took the first steps. And then everybody looked at what the evidence was, saw that this was working in good ways and could see ways in which to improve it, and eventually decided, yes, we'll move along these lines, we want to join in this. And so it was very incremental, very, very pragmatic, and eventually led to people saying, well, sovereignty didn't make sense unless it was pooled. And so you got the creation of Europol, Eurodac and everything, all those kinds of things at a time when one wasn't talking about a common asylum policy or a common juridical or judicial system to exchange information, or even a common visa system. Those things were not on the agenda.
Some of those kangaroos, the MEPs who were part of the kangaroo group, as you called it, would have been British kangaroos, weren't they? British MEPs. Who were they?
Yes, you had the British MEPs have been extraordinarily influential, I think, in Europe in the way in which they changed the way the European Parliament worked. Because when the EC was first formed, it was nothing but a consultative chamber which could be ignored. By 1992, it was getting real legislative power, a right to be heard and a right to be consulted, even if it didn't have the final say on legislation. And it got a right of initiative and had the right to say no to the budget, not pass the budget. But the Brits introduced things like question time. They introduced all kinds of standing committees and ideas, which were again informed by the practicalities of actually having an accountable democracy, a parliamentary responsibility, an executive council and commission working together and being directly accountable to the European Parliament, which was only first elected in 1979. So it was a nascent parliament with MEPs who were not has-beens and who were beginning to make a career for themselves in Europe and seeing that Europe could be developed into something that could be a force for good at the time when we had the war in Yugoslavia. And at a time where people were saying, well, let's make this concept of European citizenship and this idea of freedom of movement really tangible for people in a way that's going to be beneficial to them.
One of the MEPs, I remember the 1990s, my MEP was absolutely wonderful, called Anita Pollack, fantastic MEP. And she had a very close association with another great European woman who actually didn't start out as a very pro-European, but ended up very pro-European, Barbara Castle, trying to get rights into social rights into Europe. People often forget, don't they, Juliet? And you've described it now very, very well, that Britain hasn't just been a taker from Europe. Britain has been a giver. There are many, we're talking about them now, many often very practical ideas, very pragmatic ideas. I mean, even we said it. Even Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s had the idea of taking away these non-tariff barriers that are all going to be coming back again in the next few weeks. It's underestimated, isn't it? And freedom of movement was part of that, wasn't it? Part of that idea to, if you describe, to make
very much so.
Make our lives simpler. It's not an ideology, freedom of movement, is it? It's about making life simpler for people.
Well, if we go back, Roger, if we go back to before the single market was actually the glimmer of a reality, you would have trucks standing in the ports with 14 sheets of paper filling out bureaucratic forms. And I can remember they called this document the single administrative document, the SAD document, and kept saying, wouldn't it be great if we could replace that with one or none? And that was a hugely pragmatic step. But at the same time, you also had, particularly in the Labour Party, where there'd been a lot of scepticism around Europe, you have people like David Martin in Scotland, Richard Corbett in Yorkshire and Humberside. You had MPs of both parties being willing to think about the ways in which they were going to make this work. And they would have difficult conversations, and there would be all this argument about, do we have subsidiarity, and what does confederation mean, and is it a federal state? All the things that have been thrown up in the air again. But they would look at it and say, well, how do we make Europe work for people? Because it's people who are going to shape the future. It's not just about trade, and it is getting mutual recognition of qualifications. It is making sure that young people in particular are able to take advantage of mobility when you get rid of passport barriers and all the paraphernalia that attended paper-based visa systems, getting different currencies every time you wanted to travel anywhere, rather than being able to hop onto a boat or a plane without any real preparation.
So in a way, we've gone full circle. I mean, we're seeing these images. I know it's to do with COVID at the moment, but soon it'll be to do with the end of freedom of movement, of lorry parks and lorry drivers not being able to get home for Christmas, stacked up for miles and miles on the M20. I wonder in those days in the 1980s, before freedom of movement, when they were filling out all those forms? Do you think the government of the day went around handing out cereal bars to the lorry drivers?
No, because people at that stage knew it was going to take time to get across the Channel or to get across the North Sea. The scandal about what's happened now is that it is not just about COVID in my mind. If you've opened Marston Airfield, that was a preparation for Brexit. And what they're trying to do is hide the fact that they knew that there would be a disastrous impact of closing the borders, getting out of the single market. And they've made preparations for that very badly. And the COVID crisis has merely exacerbated that. And I don't think one should really conflate the two, because it's very easy for the media to present it like this. And I think it's very dishonest, because COVID merely shows how bad it is when you've got inadequate border arrangements and you're pretending that it's not going to affect everything, the daily lives of people, and of course it is.
That's absolutely right. I agree with that. But what I wanted to say, I suppose, is that in a sense, we've seen this before. We've seen it in the 1980s when, as you said, people had to fill in 14, lorry drivers had to fill in 14 forms, and it took a long time to get across the Channel. And in a sense, that was what prompted the long journey which you've been describing to us. And all of the work, much of it led by British MEPs and governments of both political colours over a generation and a half or more to get to the point where we are today. And the point we are today is where we have free movement in Europe. But of course, as far as free movement is concerned between the EU and the UK, that is about to end. And so, having lived and been so much a part of not just, as you say, developing free movement, but all of everything that came into the mix, all of the challenges that we had to face because of that, how could we actually arrange ourselves so that the benefits outweighed the challenges that we face? All of that work got done. How do you feel at this moment where, well, one can perhaps imagine how you must feel, but what would you tell us about what your thoughts are, perhaps, as well as your feelings at this moment that Britain is ending free movement with the European Union?
I think there's genuine grief. People really are heartbroken. People set up their own families, their lives, on the basis of no borders. They treated Europe as though it were one country, in effect, in which they could live, love, work. That's the cliche. Within those borders. And I think for young people now to be in a situation where they are locked in to a little island, which is no longer going to participate in the phenomenally influential Erasmus exchange programs, have the freedom of movement to go on stag nights and parties anywhere they wanted, be able to undertake apprenticeships, learn from each other, have more linguistic diversity, is such a myopic approach to take to anything in the world as it is now. It is, in my mind, totally idiotic. And I think the damage will be long lasting. If one looks at 14-year-olds now, and one looks at what their prospects are, they're very, very narrow compared to, say, an average 14-year-old in Finland or one in Ireland. And if one looks at younger children, their worlds have shrunk, and they've been deliberately shrunk. And it is like being incarcerated in a world that it was forgotten, and a world to which we never wanted to go back. So I think the challenges facing anyone in Britain are huge, and it shouldn't be forgotten just how much damage has been done to people, serious damage. And it wasn't just the fact that, it's very easy to say, oh, the metropolitan elite and those who could travel were the beneficiaries of freedom of movement. They weren't. Everybody benefited hugely. And we changed the way in which our economy was run to just-in-time delivery. We changed the whole way of looking at the world by experience. And people are now going to have an experience which is damaging, parochial, laced with jingoistic nonsense, lots of xenophobia, a media that is not critical and hasn't been critical for donkey's years. Some of them are very ignorant. MPs who are, in some cases, equally ignorant, and a whole world that people who were born after the Second World War, right up till 2 or 3 years ago, enjoyed. All that's gone. For what? To make us poorer? That to me is illogical, and that's the most polite way of putting it. It's illogical and it's ignorant. If it's done for ideology or for any other reason, it is not, to my mind, democratic or legitimate to deliberately impoverish a country unnecessarily. And that's what's my biggest fear for young people at the moment. They're facing an impoverished future. They're not going to be able to benefit from all kinds of initiatives on digital society that's being taken by the EU, on a common health union, on all the innovative research, all the programs that are being developed within the EU by means of having interaction with citizens. The Commission actually asking people, what do you think about this? How should we deal with austerity in future? Should we have a common wage for everybody? And trying to pull ideas in order to make a better world. And the Brits, no, the government shut them out of it. Why?
Yeah, I've certainly lived, loved and worked in Europe and been very, very grateful and appreciative of that opportunity, which started for me as soon as I left university. And I think, perhaps when in those days, a long time ago now, it was just a few of us that had the opportunities. We were very privileged, but I've met so many people along the way over the last 30 years or so from all parts of the UK, all walks of life, all kinds of backgrounds, who for all sorts of reasons have benefited from freedom of movement and who all have their story to tell. And in a sense, that's what Europe is for me, although I've spent a lot of my time politics and academia and talking, about the European Union as you do. As you've just said, it's really what it comes down to is all of those human stories, all of those human connections that have developed and enriched our personal lives, professional lives in many cases, working lives. But the country, I think, and Europe are part of the great kaleidoscope, part of the great tapestry that is Europe today. And I saw on Twitter the other day somebody was saying, they brought the image to mind of the end of the Vietnam War. Not that obviously we want to think of our relation with Europe in a warlike way, although there are people who like to do that, and they're totally irresponsible to do that. But the image was of the last helicopter out of Saigon, and that was a very, very striking image. I wonder, I was actually in Berlin at the time the Berlin Wall came down, a very striking image. I never thought I'd see a time when walls and barriers were going back up again. One wonders what the image will be that stays in people's minds, goes into the history books for this important moment that we're experiencing now. It won't be the lorry parks in Dover or what it'll be. But the thing about the helicopter from Saigon was that you were probably allowed to sort of take one small object with you. I don't know whether you were or you weren't, but one might imagine that you were. And of all of the things you've been telling us about, Juliet, that have been happening since you won European Woman of the Year in 1992 up to where we are now, 2020, free movement about to come to an end, there was one thing that you could take in your bag as you climb into that helicopter that's going to take you across into this new world of 2021, the end of free movement, and Britain leaving the single market and so on. What would that one, if you were allowed to keep one thing from everything that is being jettisoned on the 31st of December, what would that one thing be?
EU citizenship and freedom, as exemplified by freedom of movement and the Burgundy passport. Yep. The passport is the symbol, isn't it, of EU citizenship? So I would take that.
well, hopefully it'd be a long time before yours expires. And what about
it's gone, hasn't it? It has gone. That's the point. People in Britain are shocked when they get these blacky blue bits of passport. But everything that is associated with the Burgundy passport, the EU citizenship with rights, social rights that you were talking about before, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, that's gone. Everything that made this world of ours a better place, where we could criticise each other and try and improve things for the next generation, that's been jettisoned.
It's been devalued in a way, the passport, hasn't it? It's there's a world ranking of nationalities and passports.
Yes.
We've slipped down the league table exactly because we've had these rights that you just described being stripped away, and it devalues the not just the pound in your pocket, but the passport in your pocket as well. So
and it seeks to erase history. It seeks to erase the history of European integration since 1945 and the role that all the states have played together, creating a sense of European solidarity, a sense of togetherness, and a sense that we can do better and we must do better and we dare to do better.
Yeah. By working together, by standing together. And that's a lesson I think the Europeans have learned. And they know that their destinies are intertwined. And so you'll end up with your blue passport, made, of course, in France. What would your message, though, be to the next generation of young Europeans? What would your advice be to the young Juliet Lodge who is going to miss out now on the European year? What would your advice to her be in terms of what needs to happen next going forward?
I'd say dare think of a better world and how you can work together and maintain the links, because this situation cannot persist. And you will become young parents yourselves. You've got to envisage what you want for your own children as well as what you want for yourselves and your parents, and what kind of a Europe you want to be part of. Because at the moment you've been incarcerated and cut adrift. So dare think of something better. Dare think of how you want to achieve it, and dare go and do it.
I may say so, inspirational today as it was when I first came across you in 1990. As you know, you've lived in Berlin. I think you know that I've lived in Berlin. I think in the 1960s when the Berlin Wall went up, people hoped that they would see the day when it came down again. They did. And so let us hope in this moment of loss that we mourn of all, not just free movement, but all our rights as EU citizens. Let's hope that we will see the day when we get them back again. Juliet Lodge, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And it's been
Merry Christmas.
Pleasure to talk to you. Merry Christmas. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Okay.
So I'm with Tony Venables, who is the founder of the ESIT Foundation in Brussels. Hello, Tony. Tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're based right now.
Okay, I'm based at home on the outskirts of Brussels, and I've been living here actually since the UK joined the European Union. So I've had a long career in European affairs. I started off as a Eurocrat, and I got bored with that. So I then took over the consumer lobby called BEOC. I don't know if you've heard of BEOC, but it's now quite a big outfit, quite a powerful outfit representing consumers. And while I was there, a lot of people were wondering how to deal with Brussels. So I set up ECAS, European Citizen Action Service, at the time when the Maastricht Treaty was ratified and free movement started there was a lot of interest in getting involved in the EU. So we helped create a lot of new European associations. When I retired from ECAS, I got very interested in European citizenship and set up a foundation called ECIT, which is a think tank devoted to this theme. Of course, it's a theme that a lot of people touch on, people like New Europeans touch on aspects of European citizenship, but it seemed to me there was no organization working full-time on this. So I set up ECIT in 2015. And more recently, a task force of Erasmus students called Voters Without Borders, which is demanding full political rights attached to freedom of movement. And I think you would agree with me, Roger, that if we had full political rights attached to freedom of movement, Brexit might never have happened.
Well, that's certainly true. If EU citizens, the 4 million EU citizens in the UK had the vote in the referendum, then Brexit would not have happened because on the whole, one doesn't expect Turkish to vote for Christmas, even though I'm not suggesting that EU citizens in the UK are Turkish. And you mentioned Voters Without Borders, this European Citizens Initiative, which is happening at the moment. And I think it's a reminder that there's much more to free movement, Tony, isn't there, than just crossing borders. And I just wonder, you've been set it out. You've been a pioneer for free movement rights, European citizenship rights over several decades now, actually, and it made an enormous contribution, really, building an important legacy for European citizens. But how did it all get started for you? How did this kind of interest in free movement and our rights as EU citizens, because of course our free movement rights became rolled up into this idea of European citizenship, as you said, at the Maastricht Treaty, but they predate that. What was it that sort of first made the penny drop for you, that there's actually much more to this idea of free movement in European citizenship than meets the eye, to put it mildly?
There was a very precise trigger, and that was a declaration by the heads of government that the single market was going to come into force on 1st of January 1993 for goods, services and capital, but not for free movement of persons. Although these four freedoms are supposed to run together. We've heard a lot about that in the Brexit negotiations. And that was a trigger for us to say, well, actually this isn't really acceptable. Why should people be left behind the market? So we launched a hotline. And at this point in history, this is completely unknown for a European outfit like ECAS to appeal directly to citizens. But people did respond very well and sent in their stories about, the difficulties they had crossing the border. We did a report with all the case histories. We took it down to the European Parliament, where the MEPs organized a hearing for us. We had a lot of press and television, and we were very closely watched by the Commission, and in a sense, copied by the Commission. This was a catalyst. The hotline was very much a catalyst for the setting up of Europe Direct, Your Europe Advice, which was actually still run by ECAS with a team of 60 lawyers helping people with their European rights. Solve It is another initiative. So I've been very much involved with all of that over the years. And I think the lesson for me is that actually that freedom of movement has to be campaigned for. It's not that solid. It's relatively recent. And I think the fact that we were campaigning for it did make a bit of a difference, actually.
It's a remarkable story, and I think it's an inspiration to the young people you mentioned who are organising the ECI Voters Without Borders to give the full political rights to mobile EU citizens in the EU. Inspiration to initiatives like that today and many other civil society initiatives understand the role that you as a civil rights activist in those days and civil society organisations in general played in bringing about the successive development in the way in which free movement operates and the strengthening of our rights to freedom of movement and EU citizenship rights, the role of civil society. And we can look at that time and learn from those stories and understand that it really does matter that people engage and they join pro-European organisations and they campaign. But I want to ask you, Tony, I mean, the court has also, hasn't it, has also played a role in developing this. I mean, it is really extraordinary when you say, yes, when the four freedoms, the so-called integrity of the single market, four freedoms, capital, services, goods, and people, the rights people were being dragged behind. And of course, as Britain leaves the European Union, we will still have freedom of movement of tins of tomato and Brussels sprouts and bags of potatoes, but we will no longer have freedom of movement of people. I just wonder whether at the time, perhaps people thought, well, we're not really talking about freedom of movement of people, we're talking about freedom of movement of workers. But of course, workers are people. I mean, you're not surprised by that, neither am I. We're both workers ourselves. But a lot of people were, and they suddenly realized that we wanted workers, we got people, and people have rights, they have human rights, and they have families, and they have all kinds of connections. And the court took a pretty dim view of that, didn't it? The idea that this was just about workers, not about people. And from there, from some celebrated cases, European citizenship has been able to thicken and develop. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I think that the introduction of European citizenship in the Maastricht Treaty was a logical development because, free movement of workers had been established in 1968, and it was only very recent history that it was extended to students and pensioners, self-employed people. So on top of that, the Maastricht Treaty, said that freedom of movement is a right of the European citizen, provided you have sufficient resources and health cover not to be a burden on the host member state. So freedom of movement has never been actually totally free or totally without conditions. It took some time for the court to react to the Maastricht Treaty, but when it did, in a series of landmark judgments, it made this actually a real citizenship. I mean, it established that you could go to court to claim your European citizenship against a member state which was trying to restrict your freedoms, and you could have a good chance of winning. I think recently, and this is partly an effect of Brexit, the court has become a lot more cautious. But I think you're right to say that it is essentially the court which puts European citizenship on the map, and its case law was then codified in what's called the Citizenship Directive, which is about free movement of EU citizens and their family members. The European Court has played an essential role, that's for sure.
So, yeah, the court has driven driven things forward and thickened up this idea of European citizenship, including our rights to free movement. But the campaigning has also continued, and the intellectual work and the academic work and the political work, and you've been absolutely at the heart of that all the way through, up to the point where you actually decided to set up the ESIT Foundation. So what is the ESIT Foundation, and what prompted you to do that?
That was essentially because although a lot of people relate to European citizenship, there's no organization which is devoting, themselves full time to exploring European citizenship. And it seemed to me that there was a gap there. The difficulty, I think, with European citizenship is that it can mean so many different things for different people. It can end up as a bit of an abstraction. I mean, there are some organizations which focus on free movement rights. There are others which focus more on citizen participation in EU decision-making. And then there's a third group which look at the wider aspects of a European citizenship, of belonging around Erasmus and other programs. And of course, a proper citizenship is all these three things. I mean, it has to be about rights, participation, and belonging. And those features have to stand together. So we started off ESIT by producing some guidelines to bring this very scattered transnational citizenship together and try to make it more understandable. And we've organized, as you well know, because you've been a very active participant, Roger, but every year we've organized a special conference to bring together civil society representatives, academics, and policymakers, because we saw a need for a lot more, not just interdisciplinary dialogue, but also dialogue across, different sectors to try to develop a consensus about how to develop this citizenship.
Well, you've had a wonderful convening power through the annual citizenship conference of the ESIT Foundation, and I'm delighted to come every year and participate, because you bring together such a wide range of individuals who are involved in development of our rights as EU citizens and free movement, particularly also from the Commission, the European Commission, high-level officials and rather senior members of the European Parliament who are quite influential as well. And I just wondered, Tony, you said, at the start of this conversation 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, when you started out, there was so much to do to flesh out this idea of freedom of movement and then European citizenship. And you said, well, when we started, the Commission more or less copied us. Today, I think they listen, don't they? But I perhaps they're not just reading everything across into what the Commission and the European Union do that you might like. But are there things that you could still point to today where you can say it really is making a difference? They not only have they listened, but they've really taken on board and tried to change things, perhaps in relation to the European Citizens Initiative, perhaps any other aspect of our European
citizenship. I mean, I think you're right, Roger, that it's harder now to have an influence on the EU. The whole field is much more crowded. There's a lot more lobbies around some 30,000 lobbyists around the EU. So there's a lot of competition. I mean, I think we can still have some success. I think the fact that we launched a citizens' initiative on political rights did lead the Commission to commit very quickly to revise the existing directives on the rights to vote in local and European elections in its legislative program for next year. We participated in a hearing in the European Parliament already. We've had about a dozen MEPs coming to our meetings, our virtual meetings this year. And in its citizenship report of 2020, which was published on 15th of December, the Commission does go further and sort of recognize that, okay, people can vote in local and European elections, but they can't vote in their country of residence in national elections. And some, including quite a lot of us Brits, can't even vote back home in national elections, which made it harder, of course, to win the referendum in 2016. It wasn't just the EU citizens in the UK who were disenfranchised, but people from the UK who had been living abroad for more than 15 years. I think we're on to something. I think that freedom of movement, we've all tended to rely a bit too much on our rights, on the courts, and that's fine up to a point, but the political discourse is very important. And if you've got an anti-immigration discourse, the rights get watered down and they can get seriously threatened. So the 13 million EU citizens resident in other member states need much more of a voice and more political clout, especially since the number has gone down from 18 million to 13 million with Brexit.
Well, as you rightly said, if the 4 million EU citizens in the UK had had the right to vote, Brexit wouldn't have happened. But now we're up against the stripping of rights, not just from the 4 million, but from the 65 million British citizens. And I know there are some people who feel that EU citizenship rights is, in fact, it's sometimes said it's a kind of fundamental status. And you might think that if one uses words like fundamental status, that it's not something that can easily or ever be taken away. What's your view about that, Tony? I mean, we really are at a moment, a very depressing moment in history, as 65 million people are stripped of their European citizenship rights overnight. But there are some people who believe that that can be challenged. And what's your view about that?
I think it can be challenged. I mean, it's very difficult. I wrote to Amber Rudd in the UK, Didier Reynders, who was then the foreign minister in Belgium, to Guy Verhofstadt, to the Commission president, about my own situations, saying I really found this intolerable. I mean, I'd assumed that I could remain a European citizen, and I got nowhere. I mean, I tried taking it to the European Ombudsman, who said that this is a policy choice to deprive you of your EU citizenship. It's not maladministration. And the lawyers who were helping me, thanks to an excellent organization called the Good Lobby, said it's going to be very hard to challenge a consensus among the institutions that if the UK leaves the EU citizenship goes automatically with that, because it's linked to being a national of a member state. Of course, this can be challenged, and we're actually, as ESIT, we put in a request to intervene in the European Court in a case which will be heard probably sometime in the course of next year. And I hope that this case will be an opportunity to bring more out into the open, that of course it's not normal that 65 million people are stripped of a citizenship status without being properly informed that could happen, without any process or let alone right of appeal. So yes, it's a challenge which should definitely be made and supported.
Well, perhaps one of the lessons from your 35-year involvement with this issue of European citizenship is possibly longer, is if you don't ask, you don't get. So we have to keep asking, and we have to keep hoping, and we have to keep fighting. But right now, it's a difficult moment. Britain is leaving the economic union, not just the political union. British people are losing their free movement rights. EU citizens are losing their rights to move freely, travel, work, and live in the UK. But despite all of this sort of doom and gloom, is there a positive message that you would take from
I think
you have today towards the future, and what is it?
I think there is, actually. I think there's one thing we haven't talked about, which is worth looking into, and that's Schengen. After the EU said we wouldn't get the fourth freedom on 1st of January 1993, everyone waited for the Schengen Agreement to be implemented, which it was a few months later. And we did a hotline on the introduction of Schengen, which showed that this really was freedom of movement, in the sense that EU citizens had been able to move around reasonably well because we could invoke the start of the single market. But it was a real progress for third country nationals, because they no longer needed visas to go to other member states. They could travel with their ID cards. And so we spent a lot of time as a campaigning group for freedom of movement, following Schengen, actually, and watching its expansion. And I think a point to be made in relation to the UK, one point to make in relation to the UK, is that there was a lot of talk at the time of whether the UK could join Schengen. And the government at the time was pretty divided. There were lots of conferences and expert opinions. Some of them might be worth looking at again, because the UK was very keen to join aspects of Schengen, the security side of it, and the exchange of information, which was instigated through the Schengen Agreement. But it didn't want the abolition of borders aspect of Schengen. I think personally it was a big mistake by the EU to allow the UK to be somehow a sort of partial member of Schengen, or a hanger-on, in the sense that they could participate in some aspects, but without accepting the freedoms. Schengen is worth looking at because the UK is now in a situation where not only is it outside the EU, but it's outside a zone which includes non-members of the EU, such as Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, Liechtenstein. I mean, they're part of Schengen. So really the UK is very much out on a limb in terms of freedom of movement. Perhaps this isn't sufficiently realized, but the UK, if I read, I admit I haven't studied every word of the agreement of Christmas Eve, but the UK wants to participate in all the security aspects of freedom of movement. And I think that pressure can be exerted to say, yes, but if you start to make life very difficult for people at borders, and if you don't envisage at any stage becoming part of Schengen, this security aspect shouldn't really be unconditional. I mean, I think conditions can be put on the UK, and I think one can protest about the position of the UK as not being properly balanced, because the security aspects are simply the reverse side of the coin to freedom of movement. I think the difficulty, though, which we saw with freedom of movement throughout the history, is that there isn't really an effective
pro-free movement lobby. And we were a disinterested lobby of essentially individuals, fighting the case of people who had been held out at borders for no real reason. But there are also bigger interests involved, like the hauliers, the professionals, the traders. And at some point, they need to come together to make sure that free movement stays, and that, even after 1st of January, that we don't just get a new border with the UK, which on paper could be far worse than practically any border that we have at the moment.
Well, the phrase, you don't know what you've got until it's gone, comes to mind. And I think it'll be a different situation where, as well as discussing freedom of movement at seminars organised by the ESIT Foundation in Brussels, we're having conversations about freedom of movement while we're standing by our cars and lorries in traffic jams leading into the port of Dover. It may well be that the importance of freedom of movement comes home to us at that point. Tony Venables, founder of the ESIT Foundation, thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you for everything you've done over so many years and continue to do and will do in the future for our rights as EU citizens and freedom movement. And thank you above all for, even in these difficult, challenging times, leaving us on with a positive note and a positive vision for the future, and the reminder that it really does make a difference if people get involved and take the future in their hands and campaign for the things that they believe in and the things that are right and things that can make life better and simpler for all of us. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dimitry Kochenov, and I specialize in citizenship law. I am sitting here in my Groningen room, and what I will be talking about is how Brexit has affected the quality of British nationality. Of course, quality of nationality is something that might strike you as strange, but I will explain why it actually makes sense to speak about nationalities in terms of quality. Not all of them are the same. So why am I the best person to do it? Let's say I have just published a book which is called Citizenship with MIT Press, which is precisely following this paradigm of citizenship and nationalities, and tries to look at the world as a world of haves and have-nots in terms of citizenship quality. So the basic assumption is that your citizenship is not always a bundle of rights. Sometimes your citizenship is a bundle of liabilities, and liabilities only. So then how do we position British citizenship before Brexit and after Brexit on this line, the spectrum of quality of nationality? In order to look at the whole world, I have done the Quality of Nationality Index, which Hart Publishing published. And this Quality of Nationality Index does this trick for all the citizenships that we know, including the statuses which would sometimes be issued in parallel by the same country, like the UK, as a good example, which has several statuses existing in parallel. So citizenship is not always one citizenship per country. So let's look at how Brexit affects citizenship quality. But first, we need to know what such quality actually means. So we will delve into the quality of citizenship. And the first premise, just to start with, is that citizenship is, first of all, and most importantly, besides the political realities of citizenship, is about staying in a particular place and being authorized, being able to take up employment or any kind of gainful activity, and to establish a life in a territory which is bounded by a particular state or other authority. So normally, a citizen of the US is able to live in the US, to work in the US, to study in the US. And that's the main added value of American citizenship, besides self-organization of American policy, because the majority of foreigners cannot simply decide to enter. They will need to ask for permissions. It will be extremely difficult, etc. And so quality of citizenship is not only about the state of economic development of your own state, the state of human development of the same territory. It's also about what you can do outside of the state of nationality. So it's not a secret that we are all greeted by the color of our passport. And there are horrible passports, as I already mentioned. A passport is a reflection of nationality, and there are wonderful passports. So here we see the German passport through the last years, as opposed to the Afghan passport through the last years. The larger the figure, the higher the quality of nationality. And as I already mentioned, since the quality of nationality is something more complex than simply the level of economic development of your country, we can have some surprises. So, for instance, nationality of a country which is microscopic and has no economy basically whatsoever in terms of absolute numbers compared with the economy of the world, can be overwhelmingly better than a nationality of a powerful economic giant such as India, for instance. So if we compare on the screen Liechtenstein with India, it's absolutely clear that in terms of nationality equality, it's infinitely better for any human being to be a Liechtensteiner as opposed to an Indian. Why? So let's go through these components in order to prepare ourselves to the story of what actually happens with Brexit and what will happen with UK citizenship on the 1st of January. So the citizenship of Liechtenstein is so much better than the citizenship of India, because besides internal development, Liechtenstein also allows for two things for its citizens. First, it allows for unrestricted travel all around the world. And by unrestricted travel, I mean visa-free access to the absolute majority of territories. The number of bounded territories which you can access with a particular passport for tourist purposes or non-long stay purposes is important. But also the kind of territories you can access is also fundamentally important. So, for instance, we have citizenships like the Russian one, which grants you access to more than 100 countries and territories. But all those countries and territories are not particularly highly developed if we look at the HDI index, and they don't boast leading economies in the world. So on that count, sometimes if you look at a passport like with citizenship like Bosnian, being a Bosnian on this count is much better than being a Russian, although Bosnians can enter for tourist purposes many countries less. If you compare absolute numbers. Why so? Because Bosnians can travel to the European Union, and because Bosnians can travel to many other attractive destinations which are behind the visa wall for the Russians. And of course, since it's an index, we work with raw data which are provided by the International Air Transport Association, IATA. It's impossible to look at the actual thick anthropological story of the difficulties of the acquisition of those visas. So the issue is either you need a visa or not, and that's what we're looking at. So when we look at the miserable quality of the Indian nationality in terms of providing for international travel, we don't even factor in the important aspect of this story that many Indians, even if they apply for a visa, will have a refusal rather than an actual authorization to travel. But then, of course, this tourist travel is not everything. So much more important is to be able to use your nationality in order to establish a home somewhere else. And establishing a home is about a right not only to enter and to stay for a while, but about moving residence. And more citizenships around the world now provide for this kind of right. So now you have a map in front of you, which provides a gradation of the world by the amount of territories which you can enter on the basis of your nationality and where you can settle. So as we see, particularly in Europe, but also elsewhere in the world, it's the same with the former Soviet Union, the same with ECOWAS. In Africa, the same with the Gulf Cooperation Council. It's the same with Latin American cooperation. All around the world, the majority of nationalities now grant you settlement and work rights also outside of the territory of the state that has granted you nationality. So this is a very important and probably counterintuitive development, which marks really the fundamental evolution of what citizenship means in contemporary world. And this is something that we cannot ignore, because it directly affects the horizon of opportunities of each citizenship holder of each and every country, pretty much, that we see on the map. So only the white countries out there, like China, where you sometimes need a visa in order to cross even the internal boundaries, which makes it particularly typical, like Madagascar, like let's speak something like the Philippines. These countries are deeply atypical because these countries do not follow the general trend of the rising amount of what they call inter-citizenships connected to their citizenship status. So if we look at the leaders, if you are an Icelander, then you can settle pretty much without any questions asked. In the majority of the European countries, that is more than 40 destinations all in all, including all of the European Union, including Switzerland, including even the Republic of Georgia, the unilateral decision of the Republic of Georgia. So nationalities now move away from the historical binary tie, which is the sovereign territory of the state and the status of citizenship. This kind of binary tie doesn't exist anymore. In fact, in history, this kind of development was foretold by Albert Van Dicey, the great institutionalist. And in the book, there is a small map, which you probably don't see much, but that small map shows that Dicey predicted the rise of this kind of geographical reorganization of the world based on closer ties between particular countries. So what he had in mind, and we're speaking about 1897 now, his famous lecture, The All Souls College in Oxford, what he had in mind is to conclude an agreement between the United States of America and the UK, the British Empire back then, to honor each other's citizenships equally, which means that every British national would have all the rights, including settlement, including work, including unlimited travel in the United States or the American Empire back then, pretty much, because it included the Philippines, of course. It included plenty of other territories and spaces which are not associated with the US today. And the Americans would have the same in the UK. So he called it inter-citizenships, and everybody pretty much laughed at him, saying this goes against the sovereign idea of what a citizenship should be about. A citizenship is about your motherland. A citizenship is about your own constitution. It's about your own monarch or your own head of state. And yet what we see now, more than 120 years on, is that the world has picked up this idea, even probably not directly triggered by Dicey himself, and has reorganized itself based on the inter-citizenship understandings of what each nationality status should actually bring with itself in terms of rights. So if we see at this map on the screen, we easily understand that citizenship today is not what sovereign citizenship would mean in the 19th century understanding. So your citizenship doesn't stop at your state, your citizenship doesn't stop at your empire, if we're speaking about the leading jurisdictions all around the world. And this is exactly what makes UK citizenship so special today until 1 minute past 12 or 1 second past 12 on the New Year's night, because this will be the main change once we speak about Brexit. But before announcing this main change, let me say a couple of words about travel. We all assume that travel is easy. If you are a holder of a British passport, then probably you have rarely encountered any significant problems at any of the borders where you want to go. And indeed, in the majority of cases, there would be no border at all. And this map allows you to correct your perception that our world is a borderless world. All the green territories are the territories issuing and the other statuses corresponding to the states, the citizenships of the states that allow for visa-free access to the European Union and to the United States of America. Sociologically, we know these are the two most attractive spaces on Earth. And all the rest adjusts in a way, trying to structure the status of belonging in such a way that access to those two territories would be possible. The brown ones only allow for access to the territory of the Schengen zone, only the European Union. So we see that the European Union is much more liberal than the United States in terms of allowing for access. But the take-home lesson of this map is that the majority of nationalities are too bad to even participate in this in this world which seems open to us. So the majority of citizens of the world cannot travel at all. For them, the world is a world of fences and the world of impenetrable visa barriers. Now, with Brexit, in order to look at the quality of UK citizenship, and here in this slide you will see a jump in 2016 because this is when I started counting what will happen in the cases of hard Brexit. Now all the delays in negotiations, etc., brought us to where we are, but it doesn't change the essence of the figure. What we see is that the figure is shrinking dramatically. Why? Because on the 31st of December 2020, the UK is moving from an inter-citizenship paradigm of nationality, which is the 21st century paradigm, followed all around the world, out with the sole exception of China, Madagascar, and the places like this, to the sovereignist pre-Dicey, pre-inter-citizenship paradigm, which predates the 1897 lecture at All Souls, which means that for the first time in dozens and dozens and dozens of years, having lost the empire, and in fact, we can say for the first time ever, UK passport is only good for temporary tourist travel. And it's absolutely useless on the most important side of nationality rights boost, which is inter-citizenship side, the side that would allow the bearers of the passport to settle and to start working without any kind of preauthorizations outside of the British Isles. The free travel areas will still remain, as we know, but Ireland is not a huge boost in terms of the numbers, in terms of economic and human development opportunities that British citizens will experience out there in the bigger world. So Brexit under the current agreement actually means, if we look at it from the point of view of individual rights of the bearers of the British passport, it means an absolute and total disaster. I will repeat, it means an absolute and total disaster. Why? Because all the additional rights of settlement, all the additional rights of longer term travel, work, study, etc., without any kind of preauthorizations, are withdrawn. And they're withdrawn without any reason whatsoever, also potentially undermining the status of countless British nationals, hundreds of thousands of British nationals who have been using these rights. Of course, the European Union is trying to mitigate this shrinking by guaranteeing at least the rights of those who are currently present in EU member states. Hopefully, Switzerland will do the same hopefully Norway will do the same, etc. We will see what kind of agreements will be concluded. But as things stand, this move to a sovereignist understanding of citizenship, which makes Britain highly particular and pushes it in the direction of China and Madagascar, in fact, is a huge blow to the horizon opportunities of all the British nationals, especially the young ones, especially those, because we know that the younger people are usually more mobile and potentially more ready to experience the rights of their nationality to the full. So now, where Icelanders, Croatians, Estonians, and Swiss guys have plenty of rights, the Brits don't have any. And now, what do we see in terms of numbers here? If we look at the rankings of world nationalities, Britain has been on the very top in terms of the quality of rights that it would associate with its main passport. I'm saying main passport because there are also colonial, semi-colonial statuses. We will not go into that. It was on the top precisely because on the side of travel, it was an excellent document. Economically speaking, Britain was perfectly fine, and on the side of settlement, the UK was one of the most integrated statuses of nationality. It was a status of nationality which fully belonged to the Western world, as it were, which is the world of intercitizenships. Before the current Western world took shape, interconnected, rich states of Western and later bigger Europe, the UK, of course, had an empire, and this empire would ensure that all the holders of British documents, there was a lot of race discrimination going on, but the majority of those coming from the British Isles would fully benefit from white privilege there. So all those guys would have unconditional, almost unconditional access to all the parts of the empire, and all the parts which were under de facto control. So there was a lot of space there to explore. Now, without the empire and without the intercitizenship access to the territory of the European Union, the UK, for the first time in its history, in its recent history, is really confiding its own citizens to precisely the territory of the British Isles. And this is a catastrophe. To measure this catastrophe, and catastrophe is not a word that is inflated, because if we look at the drop in the basic quality and standing of British nationality compared with the other nationalities provided by states and jurisdictions all around the world, we see a drop of more than 30%. And this drop brings the UK from the top 10 to the level of Argentina, slightly below Chile. And those places are not the places the nationality of which would ever be in demand. In fact, if we look at contemporary sociology of citizenship, especially Yossi Harpa's work, but also Christian Jobke and others, it's absolutely clear that the world of citizenship statuses divides into several categories of quality of nationality in terms of the rights which are associated with particular status. So the UK was always at the helm of it, and now it's moving into a solid middle ground of solid second-rate nationalities of the world. So the UK nationality will be better than China and probably better than the majority of the African ones, but it will be way worse than the majority of what we are used to calling as Western nationalities, including Australia and including Canada, etc. So it's a huge drop. Have we ever seen such a drop before? And here the question, unfortunately, is no. Because even when we measure the change in the quality of nationality, which would be triggered by severe civil wars, by heavy social unrest, or by international blockade, what we have seen with Qatar, for instance. The drop in quality is significant, but it's not in any way comparable to the more than 30% drop that the quality of UK nationality will experience at midnight on the 31st of December 2020. So 2021 is starting for British nationality, in fact, as a year of mourning for a great status, which is lost until the moment when the British government, should it ever wish to recuperate some of what has been lost, starts renegotiating. And we don't see much in the agreement with the EU today, but good news, and this is where I probably finish, good news for the UK is that probably free movement agreements would be possible bilaterally between the UK and individual members of the European Union or individual members of the EEA, which means that if the UK really feels like practicing the anti-Polish or anti-Romanian sentiments, it is now possible. But this possibility, of course, and by this possibility, I mean Prime Minister Johnson traveling to The Hague and concluding a bilateral free movement of persons agreement, say, with the Netherlands. It's something that the UK can do, definitely, and it's something that the Netherlands definitely can do if the UK provides for sufficient concessions, because the UK is now begging for something. So this is something that the UK can do with any country around the world. The UK is absolutely sovereign to do this. But it's absolutely clear that the amount of countries which would grant British citizens full access to their territory on a reciprocal basis will not be the same anymore compared with what has been lost with leaving the European Union. So I don't want to bemoan the idea of leaving a union. Any union can be redesigned, any union can be reshaped, but viewed from my particular angle of expertise, which is global citizenship law, it's absolutely clear that the idea of Brexit as conducted, which brought about for the first time in recent British history, the shrinking of UK territory of rights associated with the UK citizenship to the size of the British Islands, this is something that is absolutely unprecedented and shockingly short-sighted. So future governments of the UK will have to spend a lot of time working out how to mitigate this overwhelming blow to the full amount of rights that British citizens have just been deprived of. And I think we should all ask ourselves once again, how come this overwhelming drop in the quality of rights that the Brits enjoy has at all been possible in a modern democracy? Of course, a modern democracy implies a right to shoot oneself right into the knee, but usually democracy is mitigated with the basic idea of the rule of law, which would be a check on this shooting your own knee right. And here, absolutely clearly, once we look at citizenship rights of UK nationals after the entry into force of the Brexit agreement, the rule of law checks on the occasional absurdity of democracy have absolutely failed the British population. So British passport is now a second-rate nationality, and this is not the sovereignty that the 21st century world knows and is proud of. Current sovereignty ideal in terms of citizenship is the inter-citizenship ideal, which opens up borders rather than closing them tighter and tighter and building new fences. Thank you very much for your attention.